Welcome back, everybody. This week we're going to be talking about filters, smart objects, and smart filters in Photoshop. In this video, we're just going to go over the basics of what those things are and how to use them. Let's start off with smart objects. So the foundation of editing in Photoshop, if you want to do things in a way that is smart, is to edit your images in what we call a non-destructive manner. I have just dragged and dropped this picture into Photoshop, and what I'm going to do is duplicate the layer. We'll just call this one Smart Object. And I'm going to also unlock the background layer, and we're going to rename it Regular Layer. Okay, I'm going to take the layer that I named Smart Object, and I'm going to come up here to the, let's try that again. Come up to the Layer menu, go down to the Smart Objects menu here, and click on the button that says Convert to Smart Object. What that does is it takes this layer and it makes it a Smart Object layer. So at this point, we haven't really even talked about what that is. But a Smart Object is a way of non-destructively editing images or layers in Photoshop. When you turn an image into a smart object, it's kind of like putting something into a Ziploc bag. You always have all the original contents in there, and Photoshop keeps them in there and protects them from anything that might be happening outside of it. And here's a good way to kind of showcase that. So I've got my smart object layer and my regular layer. Both are the exact same. I'm going to zoom in so you can kind of tell. We'll poke off the eyeball on and off when we don't see any change. I'm going to take both of these and I'm going to size them down till they're just very, very itty bitty. So they're just way down there now. Now I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to make sure I still have both layers selected, and this time I'm going to size them back up to fit my canvas size again. So let's zoom in. And right now what we're seeing is we're viewing the smart object layer. I can tell that this one's the smart object because it has the smart object icon in the lower right-hand corner of the thumbnail. And because it is a smart object, it is no different than how it originally looked. It has not lost quality in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. But watch what happens if I poke out the eyeball on the smart object layer and we see through to the regular layer underneath it. Now, a minute ago, that layer looked fine, right? We poked at the eyeball and it was totally fine. But since we have sized it down and then resized it back to what it originally was, I would say that it's lost quite a bit of detail. Regular layers, when you resize them in all different shapes and forms, when you make it smaller, it loses that data about the picture. It loses pixel data, where the pixels were, how many pixels were in there, and even some of the color values. But when you resize a smart object, because of the fact that smart objects are non-destructive, it always retains all of that data no matter what size it is. Now this, if we made it bigger than it originally was, sure, it would start to look pixelated. But because we just sized it down and then sized it back up to what its original values were, it looks totally fine. That's really one of the important things about a smart object, is it always retains that size and shape. It knows what it was like in the first place. Now you can also place a linked smart object, by the way. So I'm going to go to place linked and we will select a picture. It's better to select like a PSD file, but in this case, I'll just click on a picture and hit place. Anytime you place something, it automatically makes it a smart object. This is a linked smart object, so we get that little linked one. If I were to open this up in a different, let's do that actually. I'm going to say File, Open. That one's called Boy Walking. We'll open it up over here, and what we're going to do is modify this. I'm going to go to my brush tool, and I'm going to paint all over it, and then I'm going to save it, and we'll close it out. And you can see that because we had placed that as a linked smart object, it is automatically updated the linked file over here. I'm going to close that one out. You can also place images as embedded. When you do that, I can't believe I ruined that picture I had by drawing that on it with the brush. Oh well. If I place this embedded, it is its own smart object completely within this file, not linked to anywhere else. So if I were to, let's open this one, file open. If I modify this one, why do I keep messing with these? We'll just do an edit that I actually like. I'm going to zoom in, use the eyedropper tool to sample some of the color, and we'll paint out that part right there. Now, if I save this and close it, we notice that it still has the issue over here. And that's because we placed it as a regular embedded smart object instead of a linked smart object. Just one of the many reasons smart objects are great. I'm going to delete these two smart objects that we have. Let's say, delete layers. Yes. Let's actually revert this. File, revert, get this back to its original quality. There are other ways to make a layer smart object. You can place them and they'll be smart objects. You can come to the layer menu, say smart objects, and convert it to a smart object there. Or you can right-click the layer and click on convert to smart object. You can also come up here to filter and say convert for smart filters, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, and that will also make it a smart object. Now, let's say that I wanted to ruin this picture and I wanted to go on it with my brush tool. You can see that Photoshop does not want me to add, to adjust this layer at all. It doesn't want me to change the pixel information in a way that actually would overwrite the original pixel information. And if I click, it tells me I have to rasterize the smart object. So if I did want to use the brush tool, I would have to rasterize it. What rasterizing does is it takes something that's not pixels and it turns it into editable pixels. Most of the time when you're rasterizing something, you're rasterizing vectors. We're going to talk more about vectors and how they're different from rasters or raster-based images later on. But for now, all you need to know is if you have a smart object and you're trying to do something in Photoshop and Photoshop doesn't want you to be able to do it, you have to rasterize the image. Now, if you actually attempt like I just did, it pulls up that dialog box, but if you want to do it manually, you right-click the layer and you say rasterize layer. It's no longer a smart object, but it's just the pixels whenever you do that. So you have to rasterize a smart object before you can actually overwrite or change pixel data on it. Photoshop also has filters. Filters are pretty basic. I'm sure you've seen them at some point already. Let's open up this self-portrait. We dragged and dropped it. Some of them are fun. One of the most useful ones, I think, is the Liquify filter. Just filter Liquify. This basically turns your image into putty. The forward warp tool is the one that's default selected. It allows you to kind of click and drag and push and pull parts of your image around. So you can see that I'm just kind of adjusting my face here with the Liquify tool. We can see the before and after. I gave myself a little bit stronger of a chin. That's the Liquify tool. Liquify tool can be super useful on other images as well. Like, check this out. We'll pull up Liquify again. Command or Control Shift X is the hotkey for it. Look at this. It's automatically detected a face on this one, and we can change the different elements of the face. Just right over here. Right now, I'm making his right eye larger. You can adjust their noses. Looks like he's got a sneeze there. Liquify tool is a very robust tool that you can do a lot of stuff with. The pucker tool, I've selected the toolbar over here, makes things smaller. Just adjusting my brush size to be slightly larger than the thing I want to adjust. You can click on it. If you click and hold, it makes things really small. So you normally don't want to do that. We will undo that with Command or Control Shift D. And then the Bloat tool does the opposite, where it makes things larger. So if this picture, if we wanted his eyeball to be a little bit larger, make the brush size a little bit bigger, you can change the size over here, or you can use your bracket keys and just click until you've adjusted the size. Like if we wanted to move his eye up, forward warp tool, click on the eye, move it up a little bit higher. So whenever you see people that have had things shifted around, like for a magazine or on an Instagram post or something like that, what they're using is the Liquify tool in Photoshop. That's one of the useful ones. We've already talked about the camera raw filter. Filter gallery is where you can preview the way a lot of these images look. This one, it automatically pulled up poster edges. I don't use filters too often. The two that I use are the Camera Raw filter and Liquify. There's a lot in here, though, that I would encourage you to play around with. So yes, there's plenty of different filters that you can access. Some of them even have their usefulness, but if you just want a fun, different type of effect, there's stuff in filters that you can choose and use. Filter gallery is also fun because not only does it allow you to preview and adjust them, it allows you to stack. So if I wanted colored pencil, but then I also wanted a little bit of plastic wrap, I could come down here to this new effect layer button and now click on plastic wrap, and it will stack those two on top of each other, and I could adjust them for each. And if I wanted to keep it that way, I could click OK. Of course, I don't, so I'm going to hit cancel. Other filters are in here as well. That's where you can generate 3D things from pictures. You can blur your pictures. You can sharpen them. That's one that I use. I also use blur and high pass sharpen as well. You can find the edges of things. You can make it look like that. Wind is one of my favorites, where it kind of blows pixels away. Let's click stagger from the right. If you ever run a filter on it and you want to repeat that filter, oh boy, that one's going to take a little while. What you can do, let's do filter blur. Let's say just blurring it, we'll blur it a little bit. The last filter that you've run is up at the top. It's right there. There's a little hotkey that you can use to repeat it over and over and again, just continuing to hit that filter, and it will just run that last filter on yours over and over and over again. Let's see, let's undo those things. Rasterize this layer. And I'll show you an example of one way that I use a filter. So I'm going to take this layer and I'm going to duplicate it. This is how I sharpen my images. I'm going to change the blending mode of this to overlay, and then I'm going to go up here to filter, other, and high pass. This is what's called a high pass sharpening technique. I zoom in and I just pull this radius over, and the further I pull it over, the more it sharpens that particular image. If you pull it all the way over, it starts to look ridiculous. But at a nice small radius, depending on the size of your image and how your image looks, you can get a cool effect. So that's before and after. It almost makes the original look out of focus. So yeah, that's one way that I like to use filters. You can also use, I'm going to duplicate this one, and we'll say filter blur. Let's say surface blur, and we'll blur it a little bit. It blurs just the surface of things, but now check this out. If I zoom in, I'm going to add a mask. We'll say layer, layer mask, hide all. So it added a black mask. All I want to do is go to my brush tool, I'm going to knock the opacity down, and if I start painting white, it will see through to that blur layer, and it will soften the skin a little bit. So that's a fun way that you can kind of soften skin. We'll knock the opacity up so we can make the effect a little bit more pronounced. So yeah, we're just talking about different ways that you can use filters. But watch this. I'm going to first go up to Layer, Smart Object. This time I'm going to hit Convert to Smart Object, and let's run a filter on it. Let's go to Pixelate, and let's say Mosaic. And we'll adjust the cell size, gives it that kind of mosaic pixelated look. So I just ran a filter on a smart object. And if I look down here at my layers, we see some crazy stuff going on. It says Smart Filters. So when you run a filter on a smart object layer, it becomes not just a filter, but a smart filter. Let's talk about why. I'm going to open that image in its own document. Okay, so now it's doing its own thing over here. I'm going to duplicate the layer again. We will make it a smart object, and let's do the same filter. Filter, pixelate, mosaic, and we'll say OK. So we just ran a filter on a smart object, so of course it is now a smart filter. What that does is it allows me to adjust the amount of the effect. So if I didn't think that that was enough, I could come down here, double click, and I could make that cell size bigger, or I could make it smaller. If this was blur, we could blur it more or blur it less. It also gives me this white rectangle. This is actually a mask. This is not a mask for the layer, but it's a mask for the filter. So if I go to my brush tool now and start painting black, the mask is completely white right now. If I start painting black with it, let's knock the opacity up on my brush. What it does is wherever I paint black, it gets rid of the filter there. So it doesn't get rid of the layer, it just gets rid of the filter. Let's put that back where it's supposed to go. And if I got rid of it completely but wanted it to go back, I can paint white wherever I want the effect to show up, and the effect will be there. If I don't like that effect, I can poke out its eyeball. Let's actually fill this mask. Edit, fill. Let's fill it with color white. And I'm going to crop this image with my crop tool. Let's hit clear. We'll crop it, whoops, closer to his head. I'll show you a fun way that you could actually use smart filters. Okay, let's rasterize this. We'll do the whole process from the beginning. So layer, smart object, convert to smart object, or we could say filter, convert for smart filters. We'll say okay. This time I'm going to say filter, blur. Let's do a motion blur, and we will adjust the angle of our motion, and we will adjust the amount of blur as well. We'll just kind of blur them out like that. Maybe like that. And then what I can do is I can come in here to my filter mask, get my brush tool, paint black, and paint out where I want the effect to go away from. That's just kind of a cool way you could adjust that effect. I could even move this layer over if I wanted to as well. So here in this video, we talked about smart objects, what they are, how they can help you with non-destructive editing. We also talked about some of the basic filters that are in Photoshop, what they do, how they're useful. And then lastly, we talked about smart filters and how they can also help you with editing. That's it for now.